I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to the second chapter of Bradbury and Karney's Intimate Relationships book. So today we'll be discussing Influential Theories, Part 1. I'm not sure there's going to be a Part 2, though, because this is like a 70-page chapter. But today we're going to be talking about the evolutionary perspective and attachment theory. And so let's get started by talking about how great minds don't think alike. And so we'll talk about Freud and Skinner. Now, Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis, and his ideas about intimate relationships came basically from his ideas about the unconscious. And so he thought that partner choices in adulthood were influenced by motives developed during infancy and early childhood. He basically thought your personality was set at an early age. And he thought that relationship problems were a result of unresolved issues and conflicts with your parents. So his mom used to refer to him as her golden Siggy, and so that's how I like to think of him too. B.F. Skinner, who's in the picture there, was the founder of radical behaviorism, and he said that behaviors are shaped by their consequences, so that positive consequences to an action lead you to do that action more. So he said that successful relationships are based on having pleasing behaviors that are rewarded and encouraged. And so that relationship problems occur when partners unintentionally reinforce each other's displeasing behaviors. But we're not going to talk about those people. We're going to talk about, well, we'll start by talking about theories, and then we'll talk about evolutionary theory and attachment theory. A theory is an interconnected set of beliefs, knowledge, and assumptions that relate to understanding a phenomena or situation. So influential theories do three things well, and E equals mc squared, if you remember that, is Einstein's theory of relativity. They can be described formally, which means they have explicit premises and predictions. Prediction is difficult, I should say that too, whereas explanation is very easy. That's why Freud can explain everything, but he can't predict things very well. Good theories inspire research and scholarship, so they launch hundreds of studies. We would say that they're fruitful. And they make predictions that withstand multiple tests. And so the more evidence we have, the more sure that we can be that our theory is correct. That is a deductive or data-driven approach to theory formation. Well, let's start, though, with Darwin's theory of evolution, and that's him colorized in a picture to the right, because they did not have color pictures in his lifetime. This theory assumes that the brain evolved in response to specific selection pressures that led some things to lead to more successful reproduction. And so it focuses on the adaptive functions of human behavior. And so there's a couple ideas of his that are applicable to romantic or intimate relationships. For example, survival of the fittest. So a feature may be adaptive because it increases your chances of survival. And in terms of sexual selection, a feature may be adaptive because it directly increases the chances of successfully reproducing by helping you attract or compete for mates. So for example, a male peacock has that bright plumage, which makes them much more likely to be killed, and bushy mane on a lion. The belief is that humans have evolved psychological mechanisms, which are preferences, capabilities, responses, and strategies which characterize our species. And so the argument is that these mechanisms are similar to physiological organs, and that these are psychological mechanisms that are responsive to our environment. Due to the slow pace of evolution, our modern brain is very similar to our ancestral brain. And so many of the tendencies we observe today have been adaptations or were adaptations to an environment that no longer exists. And so to understand intimate relationships today, you have to consider what's referred to as the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, which is this period tens of thousands of years ago when our species took its current form. And that guy to the right is supposed to represent those people. So there's the theory of parental investment, and this comes directly from the evolutionary perspective too, that sexual selection pressures can vary based on the amount of energy and resources each parent must invest into raising offspring. So the adaptive problem for a female is ensuring that each of her children has the greatest chance of survival. So therefore, females are very selective about their mates and only choose high quality partners. And high quality means that the partner will protect them, has resources and is willing to share them, and is committed to her and her offspring. Now, males, on the other hand, have relatively low parental investment, and they face the challenge of other males gaining access to the more selective females, and so they try to get as many pairings as possible that would result in surviving offspring. So gender differences in the preferences and mating behaviors of men and women today are part of this ancestral history. So for example, even today, women prefer taller men. And as someone who's studied personal ads, that's like happens all the time. Many heterosexual women don't want to date men who are smaller than they are. And the idea is that this was adaptive for females because a taller mate could protect the female and her children from physical assault better. Men, however, are more upset by the prospect that their romantic partner is having a sexual relationship with someone else. And they don't want to devote their resources to someone else's children. And so if you've ever heard the joke where when guys meet each other, they say, hey, how's your wife and my kids? That is playing to this fear that your children aren't really your own. And in a time before paternity testing, that could be I guess it could still be a legitimate fear. So females develop preferences for cues that indicate a partner's resources and strength, and males develop preferences for fertility and fidelity. Now, the preferences of people today correspond to that time of evolutionary adaptedness in our ancestral past. And so even if today something like height is no longer linked to resources and sexual fidelity, these preferences were developed, and so they continue to persist in humans. That's the idea. There's an aside in your book that talks about scent. And so in both genders, people who are more physically symmetrical tend to have superior physical and mental health. And they're also seen as more attractive. And so this is from Thornhill and Gangstad in 1999. They said maybe it's body odor that makes a difference. So they had men and women rate the scent of t-shirts. I love that picture. That woman loves the smell of that t-shirt that were worn by members of the opposite sex. And so men's ratings of the female scents were unrelated to the women's physical symmetry. Non-ovulating women, their judgments were unrelated too. But women who were ovulating, and so would have the highest stake in the genetic fitness of their potential partner, rated the scent of a shirt worn by a facially and physically symmetrical man as more pleasant and sexy than an asymmetrical man. So this is the kind of proof that evolutionary psychologists look for. How does this perspective guide research? Well, we do a lot of cross-cultural studies in evolutionary psychology. That's actually a course I used to teach too, but I haven't taught it in several years. So they identify behaviors that characterize mating and sexuality consistently across a wide variety of countries and cultures. And so the picture to the right there is a Ukrainian bride in a traditional costume. And so the idea that brides wear particular distinctive clothing and the bridesmaids dress in similar clothes that they'll all never wear again is cross-cultural. Evolutionary psychologists argue that if they can identify aspects of mating behavior that are common to the entire human species, that these are likely to represent evolved mechanisms. And the term for this is human universals. And there are entire books of lists of human universals. And it's stuff like naming animals and believing in luck and dancing and music and even contract murder where you pay to have someone killed. That seems to be a human universal. It's in every culture. So they work from this premise that that males and females confront different adaptive challenges in terms of reproduction, and so they develop unique psychological mechanisms for meeting those reproductive goals. Let's evaluate this perspective. So people have been talking about gender differences in mating behaviors for thousands of years. It's not like Darwin came up with this idea. But the evolutionary perspective moves beyond mere description and towards an understanding of what the adaptive function of those differences are. They focused on certain questions involving behavior and gender differences, but in the search for absolutes, the rich complex variability among individuals has often been overlooked. And evolutionary psychologists study how people attract and choose mates far more than they explore what makes a good relationship last. And the other thing I would say, as someone who's taught this class, is really, in the end, all evolutionary psychology is like Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. So like How the Elephant Got His Trunk, they're really just narratives about how we ended up with the preferences that we have today, and with a patina of science slapped over the top of them. Let's talk about attachment theory. This proposes that the intimate relationships we form as adults are shaped largely by the bonds we form with our primary caregivers during infancy and early childhood. And this was developed by British psychologist and psychiatrist John Bowlby. And he wrote several volumes, and they're collectively titled Attachment and Loss. That's him off to the right there. He was familiar with Freud's theories about the impact of early childhood and how that has influences on later life. So what are some of the assumptions? He begins by observing that humans and other primates, because that's important too, that their survival requires the active presence of a primary caregiver when they're babies. And so he suggested that this extreme dependence would lead to selection pressures favoring behaviors that create and maintain closeness to an attachment figure. And that's definitionally someone who provides comfort and safety to the child. So helpless babies engage in attention-grabbing behaviors such as smiling and gurgling and looking cute like the baby to the right, and sometimes they wail in the middle of the night too. Bowlby thought that human infants evolved these early capabilities as ways of ensuring that their attachment figures stuck around to feed and nurture them. So we have evolved an attachment behavior system, and this is a set of behaviors and reactions that monitors and promotes the closest of caregivers. And so he says that this focuses on three key factors, so that we pay attention to our own internal states. And so if we're hungry, then we cry, and then that brings the caregiver over. That we keep track of our caregiver's availability and responsiveness. So they sometimes use a strange situation where oftentimes it's the mother, she leaves the room, and then how long before the child realizes that she's gone? Where's mommy gone to? And we look out for potential threats in our environment. So if there's a dog, and some kids are afraid of dogs or cats or who knows what. The goal of the system is to create and maintain felt security, which is a sense of safety and protection that allows the child to explore the world and take risks. Bowlby thought that early interactions with caregivers teach two important lessons about the world. They learn about themselves and they learn about attachment figures. So if they're treated with sensitivity and warmth, they learn that they're lovable. But if they're neglected or treated with contempt, they learn that they're unworthy of love and therefore should not expect it. In terms of attachment figures, if they're dependable and responsive, then the child learns that people can be trusted. But if they're controlling and unpredictable, they learn that people can be unreliable and potentially even dangerous. So Bowlby thought that these experiences accumulated in memory and developed into what he called working models, which are internal psychological structures that represent conscious and unconscious beliefs, expectations, and feelings that people have about themselves, about other people, and about the relationships that they engage in. So since people interpret each new experience in terms of these existing models, these working models are assumed to be relatively stable and endure over time. So Bowlby thought that this was a central part of human functioning throughout life. So if we learn in early childhood to question whether we're worthy of being loved, we could grow into adults who are anxious about keeping our partners close. He believed that every person's working models were distinct, and so they're different for everybody, like fingerprints are. But modern attachment theorists have really identified two important dimensions: anxiety and avoidance. And the views about yourself correspond to the levels of anxiety about relationships. So people who have doubts worry about their partners leaving, and some people avoid relationships altogether because they mistrust others, and so they resist depending on other people. This leads to the idea that there's 4 different styles of attachment. And the first is secure attachment, and about 60% of people are securely attached, which means that they have a positive view of themselves and others. They value relationships, but they can maintain their sense of independence away from relationships as well. And then the other 40% is split among these other 3 types of attachment. Preoccupied attachment is people who also have a positive view of others, but they have low self-worth, and that leaves them chronically high in anxiety, so they come across as being very needy. Dismissing attachment, they view others as not likely to be caring and available, and so they value self-sufficiency and are comfortable being alone. And then fearful attachment, they have a negative view of themselves and others, and this causes high anxiety and feelings that they're unworthy of care and consideration. So most researchers take a simpler approach and ask people to describe themselves along those 2 main dimensions. And adults generally seek out partners and feel better when they're threatened in some way. And the more those partners are perceived to be supportive, the more they promote this idea of felt security. So the result of hundreds of studies have found that partners who describe themselves as secure have happier, more trusting, and longer lasting relationships than people who describe themselves as insecure. Studies also find that those with insecure attachment styles report having more conflicts overall, and significantly more than their partners report in the same relationships, which means that they perceive that there's more conflict. And this conflict makes them feel insecure and gloomy about the relationship long term, so in some ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's no difference between same-sex and different-sex couples in respect to how they describe their attachment styles and their attachment-related behaviors. And adults who were interviewed about their attachment styles in their 20 years later, the researchers found, so they studied them as children and then looked at them again 20 years later. And they found 72% of them received the same classification both times. And so they believe that this is stable. Attachment styles are stable throughout the lifetime. So Bowlby argued that attachment strategies can also change in response to new experiences or relationships too. So people who get married tend to become more secure, whereas being betrayed or badly deceived, ask anyone who's been through a horrible divorce, can make a secure person more cautious or insecure about subsequent relationships. So let's evaluate attachment theory in the same way that we evaluated evolutionary theory too. So attachment theory provides researchers with a framework for studying the continuity of experiences across the lifespan. And it explains the variability in the values and expectations that people bring to their relationships. So why do some people demand a lot from their partners where they're needy and they have to constantly be checking in, while other people tolerate neglect and even abuse? And so this helps to explain that. It suggests that intimate relationships, parental relationships, and even relationships among non-human primates are all manifestations of a single behavioral system, attachment theory. And that makes it seem like it's an all-encompassing theory of intimate relationships. And so that's one of the reasons why researchers like attachment theory. So that's the first part of chapter 2, and have a great day.